I am Don Moynihan. I am the president of the Association of Public Policy and Management. I am also a professor at Georgetown University, and very excited that you could join us this afternoon. We're going to talk about Schedule F and potential for its return and what it could mean for American government. I'm going to be joined today by two people who have expertise on this topic in different ways. First, Rachel Augustine Potter is an associate professor of politics at the University of Virginia. She studies the hidden politics of procedure and process in American political institutions, with a special focus on bureaucracy and regulations. Her book, Bending the Rules, has received 2 awards from the American Political Science Association and the National Academy of Public Administration. And she's also published in many top political science journals. She has testified to Congress as regular contributor to the Brookings Institution Center on Regulation and Markets. And she's also, before becoming a political scientist, has worked in government, in OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, but also the U.S. Government Accountability Office. After Rachel, I will then have the pleasure of handing over to Jim Capretta, who is a senior fellow and holds the Milton Friedman Chair at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies healthcare entitlement programs and fiscal trends in advanced economics. He currently has served as the senior advisor to the Bipartisan Policy Center, and since 2011, a member of the advisory board of the National Institute for Healthcare Management Foundation. As with Rachel, he's also spent time in public service before his current position at AEI. He was an associate director of the White House's Office of Management and Budget for 2001 to 2004, responsible for all healthcare, social security, welfare, and labor and education issues. Previously, he served as a senior analyst in the U.S. Senate Budget Committee and the U.S. House Committee on Ways and Means. He is the author of U.S. Health Policy and Market Reforms, an Introduction, which came out in 2022, among other items. So we're bringing together a mixture of expertise, some from academia, some from the think tank world, but also a fair degree of experience from folks who have actually worked in government. What we'll do is I will start for about 10 minutes, then I will hand over to Rachel and then to Jim. We'll chat for about 10 to 12 minutes each, and hopefully that will give us a fair amount of time for questions and comments that people will have. What I'd encourage you to do as you have questions would be to post them in the chat, and we will then have a chance to discuss them after the initial round of comments. We very much look forward to your thoughts here. So I'll open up the running here by talking a little bit about what Schedule F is and the potential for its return and what it might do. So Schedule F is an executive order that President Trump signed towards the end of his presidential term, October of 2020. What it effectively did was to create a new class of political appointees along with the existing group of appointees, so Schedule A to E. And so we have plenty of political appointees in America. We have about 4,000 slots in the federal government, which is allocated to political appointees. That's a relatively high number compared to other advanced industrial democracies. And so one question is, what is the need for this additional number of appointees? And this new approach to appointees was somewhat different from the past because it took existing employees who were career officials and would convert them into political appointee status. And so people who joined through the civil service system, through the merit process, could be converted to become a political appointee, and that conversion could come involuntarily. That is to say, they might want to stay a career official, but the president could convert them to become an appointee. It just in terms of numbers here, we have some sense of the sort of scale and breadth of how this might work by looking at what happened at the end of the Trump administration. The language within Schedule F essentially identifies career officials who have some sort of policy making or policy advisory role as being eligible to be converted to this new political appointment position. That is a relatively vague and broad term, so we don't really have a good sense of how many people it would cover, but we do have a couple of indicators of the scale here. Right at the end of the administration, the Trump administration ran out of time. Other things were happening at the end of the administration, so they didn't actually process the new appointments. But at least in one agency, which was the Office of Management and Budget, the outgoing director, Russ Vought, proposed that about 89% of the career employees would be converted into a political appointee status. Obviously, OMB has a fairly high policymaking role, but that would be a fairly fundamental change to its existing standing. James Shirk, the author of the executive order, and others who support President Trump have suggested about 50,000 career officials would be a reasonable guess for how many would be converted in a second Trump administration were it to come back. It's important to understand that the executive order, therefore, was never really implemented. It was rescinded by President Biden very quickly in his administration, but President Trump has been clear, and those around him or those supporting a second Trump presidency have argued that this will be a fundamental tool in his battle to take on what he defines as the deep state. And so we should expect Schedule F to be a day one executive order if he returns. In the meantime, the Office of Personnel Management has issued a rule that would, I think, at best delay the return of this executive order, but it does have some potential effect here. As a public administration professor, this seems to me to be probably the largest change to the civil service system and the idea of merit within that system since the creation of the civil service system in the 1880s. And I think it has two aspects. One is that it would reduce the quality of government, but also it could create democratic vulnerabilities. We have research evidence that merit systems tend to outperform very politicized systems, and that career officials tend to prefer to exit out of more politicized systems, are less likely to exert effort, and also that more politicized systems invite more corruption. As president, we know from Trump's time in office, he would frequently target career officials. There is some reporting suggesting that the team that surrounds him already has lists of officials that they would seek to remove should they return to office. If we look, for example, at President Trump's first impeachment, which dealt with the withholding of aid to Ukraine, President Trump subsequently denied promotions or removed from the White House career officials who testified to Congress or who identified the potential illegality of the hold of that aid. And so again, there is partly a concern here about the damage that this would do to the competence of a career-based administration that relies on expertise, but also a concern about democratic vulnerabilities, whether law breaking would be exposed, whether people could expect retribution if they followed normal processes of providing accountability to Congress or using tools like whistleblowing options that were available to them. And so it does raise not just concerns about is this a regular government reform, but whether it would create other types of difficulties. I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to invite Rachel Augustine Potter to take up the discussion from that point.
Thanks, Don, and thanks to APPAM for putting together this webinar. This topic is, I think, very important and timely. I'm going to agree with Don and say that I think Schedule F is one of the biggest, most important things on the table for a potential Trump second term. But there are a lot of other changes to the federal bureaucracy that are also at stake, and some of them are really big as well. And to give you a sense of that, I want to return to Trump turn one and talk about some of the things that Donald Trump as president did during his first term that were really fundamental shifts in how the federal bureaucracy is managed. And there's a number of them. So to start, let's think about appointments. So lots of presidents appoint loyalists to top positions. That's pretty normal. What Trump did that was a little different is that he appointed people who did not believe in the some people that did not believe in the missions of the agencies they were appointed to lead. So this is people like Betsy DeVos of the Department of Education and Scott Pruitt, both of whom were very critical of those agencies' missions. So in addition to appointing loyalists who didn't believe in the mission, there was another thing that Trump did with the appointments process, which was he left a lot of positions vacant. And the reason he did this, if you remember, he said, I like my acting generals, right? So leaving these positions vacant gives him a lot more control over who serves in them and also allows him to, or the president, to skirt the Senate confirmation process in some cases. And so this is another sort of management strategy that's not in the traditional playbook that was used a lot in the Trump administration. We also saw reorganizations. So at the Department of Agriculture, that's most notable, right? The National Institute of Food and Agriculture and the Economic Research Service, the headquarters were moved rather abruptly from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City. At ERS, that resulted in about a 40% reduction in their staff. And at NEFA, it was 60%, just people who did not want to move to Kansas City. The Government Accountability Office has found that that move did violate the Anti-Deficiency Act, and so was illegal in that sense. And that's a point I'm going to return to in a minute. Okay, so in addition to reorganizations, we saw career civil servants being sidelined. So the Office of Personnel Management, which Don already referenced, is the chief HR office for the federal government, and they were not involved in the creation of the Schedule F executive order. And that kind of workaround for career civil servants we saw in a lot of different ways, particularly at the EPA. There was one career civil servant who's high ranking at an agency that I interviewed for a project I was working on. And she told me that she had spent her entire career at that agency's headquarters, and that during the Trump administration, she was rerouted to the Caribbean for a term and is now back in the DC. And we saw that with she's not alone. That happened to many other senior career civil servants who were not wanted during the Trump administration, but were hard to fire. We also saw of how the bureaucracy works. This was really apparent in the rulemaking arena. So when federal agencies create rules and regulations, where we saw an executive order that told agencies they had to remove 2 regulations for every new one that they created. We also saw technical changes to how costs and benefits were calculated with respect to carbon calculation and how the cost of carbon, which affects climate change regulations, makes it harder to demonstrate the benefits of climate change regulations. And we saw the changing of standards at the EPA, or the attempt to change the types of research that could be used in those regulatory processes. We also saw a number of legal challenges in court that made agencies less independent and more subject to presidential control. And we also saw a number of attacks on federal employees unions. So Trump was very much worked up about federal employees unions. He issued 3 separate executive orders on them in 2018, all of which were attempting to gut the power of those unions to work, to do their work. So reopening collective bargaining, limiting the amount of time that the workers had to spend on union work, and a number of other changes that really were intending to limit the powers. So how did bureaucrats respond in that time period? Well, a lot of them left, not that many though. Some research by Brian Libgover and Mark Richardson shows that civil rights agencies in particular lost a lot of workers, but the overall size of the federal workforce stayed about the same during the Trump administration. But we saw leaks, we saw accusations that bureaucrats were slow rolling or slowing down on work that they should have, in leaders' eyes, been working more quickly on. We saw some outright protests by bureaucrats. We saw some evidence of sabotage. The New York Times reported that they EPA, career civil servants were embedding statistics and data and regulations to make it easier to litigate against them. And we saw some complaints among Trump appointees that the bureaucrats were withholding information. So looking forward to a second term, what can we expect, right? This is what happened before. What might happen this time with regard to these other things in addition, again, to Schedule F? Well, there's a lot more competence that's going to be seen, I think. So we've had a lot of learning, a lot of failure that happened in the Trump administration, but with failure comes learning and 4 years to study. And so I think we're going to see like a lot fewer people that are inexperienced or don't know what they're doing. And I think, and this comes to like, you know, if you study comparative politics and political science, it's right out of the authoritarian playbook, is you follow the rules. You do legal changes when you want to enhance and centralize power. And so I think a lot of the changes we're going to see, if there is a Trump second term, are going to be legal, right? So the Trump regulatory challenges were 78% of them were lost during the first term in federal court. I don't think we'll see that again because those are really lost on procedural grounds. What we've seen over time, the Trump team is learning how to not have federal violations. And I would say that what the other thing we're going to see is a lot more comprehensive policy. And this really is where the Project 2025 comes in. So if you're not really familiar with Project 2025, this is a sort of a collective working group sponsored by the Heritage Foundation, but has over 90 other conservative organizations that have signed on to really think about what is the conservative agenda for the next conservative administration, be it a Trump administration or otherwise. If you go on their website, they have their act together. They have reportedly a list of over 20,000 people who could take over political appointee positions, whether that be Senate confirmed ones or, as Don has mentioned, Schedule F. And they also have a plan for most agencies. So if you look on their website, they tell you exactly what they're thinking at every single agency. And these are detailed plans. Like at the Department of Education, they're talking about moving specific programs to other agencies in the attempt to downsize that particular agency, which has not been popular with conservatives. They're talking about disbanding the Office of Post-Secondary Education, reducing the role of the Office of Civil Rights, taking action to reduce rights for transgender students, and working to privatize all student loans and get the federal government out of the student loan business. So these are some potentially really big changes, and that's just one agency. If you look at the plans, I would encourage you to, it's project2025.org. They've got a whole agenda, and so they didn't have that last time. And so this is one that sort of really big difference that we're seeing. What do I expect the response from bureaucrats to be like? I already told you what happened a lot in the last administration. Well, if Schedule F proceeds, right, we're going to see it's going to really gut sort of a lot of the GS13 to GS15 rank, I would expect. And that's where we're going to see a lot less of the sort of ability or desire and incentive for this long-term career and leadership roles for leaking or sabotaging or all of these things that the Trump people were worked up about, right? They've got a plan to deal with them now. We also see if unions are, again, sort of under attack, right? That's one way that career civil servants kind of collectively work together, and that they're going to be constrained to that. Again, a lot of exit due to low morale or fear from people below the Schedule F rank as they see that, you know, these are not desirable jobs where and a lot of research does support the idea that when people perceive their agency to be more politicized, they're more likely to leave. And the final thing I'll say before I turn it over to Jim is I think we can also expect an absolute ton of litigation. The unions have already promised to sue if any of these major things happen. And so I think we're going to see a lot of the courts working this stuff out. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And that is really helpful in providing a broader sense of how Schedule F connects to this bigger agenda for changing government. I would just add to that, there are an extraordinary number of federal employees who are eligible for retirement. And there's also some discussion about what might happen if there are very strong back to work and back to office policies imposed. And if you combine that and the potential for the types of politicization we're discussing, that could have a fairly significant effect on government retention or recruitment of employees. Jim, over to you.
Good, thank you. I'm very pleased also that APPAM pulled this webinar together, and I'm glad to be able to participate in it. I agree with the introductory comments by both of my fellow panelists here that this is a very significant issue. You know, I think I got called into participating in this because I wrote an article about how it was dangerous. And I do believe it is dangerous to the functioning of the government. And so I'm happy to be part of the conversation. I want to start by saying something that I'm not, I'm not worried about, which is having elections where there are policy disagreements between the candidates and the voters choosing someone who then tries to implement their policies. Going back, I see some of the people who are watching this webinar, some people who know this subject well too, that going back in time, one can go back to the Reagan era, and there was great concern about the appointees coming into government who were sort of pledging to downsize the government, cut a lot of programs, and move the government in a different direction. A lot of consternation about it. Many of that reported in the mainstream media and so on. A lot of worry about it. All in a certain sense legitimate policy disagreements. I didn't find it. I came into government near the end of that period. I didn't find that the problem there was that that the Reagan administration was overly politicizing the civil service. And in fact, I kind of view it as legitimate that they tried to implement their vision for government. Now, having said that, I think what we're talking about here with the Trump Schedule F is an entirely different approach, which is to, instead of trying to use the apparatus and the institutions that are there and steer them in a different direction, they essentially want to undermine the trust in these institutions, which would have a very long-lasting and negative effect across electoral cycles. And so it's a totally different kind of approach. They will argue that, of course, that the reason you need more political appointees through the Schedule F process is that the bureaucracy resists legitimate policy changes. And I think what they miss here is that if they try to take their approach, they're going to create even more mistrust of these major institutions that will outlast their time in office and will push it potentially in a very different direction that they find less attractive. What do I mean by that? Is if you replace the larger percentage of people running an organization and providing the basic work that goes into decision making with political loyalists, those who don't agree with your point of view are going to, over time, completely distrust that institution. That will feed through our society beyond just the people who are working in the federal government to people who have to use the services and rely on those big institutions to provide whatever public services they're providing. And so it will infuse our whole debate and culture with another level of distrust, which will undermine these institutions over time. So, and potentially in ways that work against what maybe the Trump administration wants to do. They might be around for 4 years, but then another group would come in and perhaps have a totally different political orientation. And if the whole institution has been politicized, they could move it rapidly and potentially in a very different direction. The second thing I want to mention is the very big problem with their approach is how do they measure loyalty, right? Which is that if you're hiring that many people, it's not going to be just sort of if you're a registered Republican or something like that. It's going to be, they've already made it clear, they're going to ask these very funny kind of questions to see how loyal you are to who. And of course, that's no way to run a government. And I think it will invite just an absolute lowering of the quality of the applicant pool, because you have to be willing to say things that many people are unwilling to say in terms of pledging loyalty to a single person. And so that by definition will lower the quality of public service. And then I do want to say this just from my own personal experience. I've been both a civil servant and a political appointee. And in my time, I don't think the professional civil service is hopelessly politicized. I think they're mistaking and labeling something that has really a different character, which is that people who work in an institution for a very long period of time become devoted to its mission. And of course, that can clash with people who come in with a very different orientation. And maybe that's natural and healthy in some ways, so that those two need to sit down and talk through how to proceed when that kind of change in direction has been called for by an election. That's not the same thing as saying that it's politicized and working for one side or the other. I think most of the professional civil service is really just devoted to the mission of the agencies they work in. And that has a different kind of, if I can use this word, and I don't mean this pejoratively, bias in a certain way. They're totally focused on that mission, and they don't want to see it undermined. Now, having said that, what's missing from this conversation is legitimate ways to steer an organization in a new direction, working with the people that are already there. That can be done. It's been proved by capable managers in federal civil service political appointees going back a long time. The most talented ones understand that you take the people that really know what's going on, you work with them, provide leadership, send them in a certain direction, and they can help you find the solutions you're looking for. So I think, but that takes a different kind of leadership, and maybe something that's a little bit beyond the Trump orbit's sort of capacities for thinking creatively about how to do these things. I want to say one last thing before my little segment is up here. We'll go to questions, which is that what types of offices are we talking about that could be very politicized? I think the language, as was referenced, is kind of vague, and it will be subject to some interpretation, which I think is probably on purpose. But if you say anybody who's working in an office that is policy oriented or policy adjacent, that's a very large, potentially large group of people. All the major cabinet departments, of course, have budget functions, some of which have several hundred people working in them. They have legislative offices that work with Congress. They have policy offices, which are the most sensitive. And they have research offices that could have big grants to universities involved, big research agendas related to the institutions they're in. And so all of that, I think, could be subject to the Schedule F type of switch. And what do you lose when you do that? It is, of course, important to provide leadership to those offices consistent with the orientation of the administration that is in power at that time. But that doesn't mean that you don't need people that are versed and deeply understand the statutes that they work with. I'm thinking of things like the Social Security Administration that has a long history with its statute and its policies around the program. Or, of course, in the Department of Health and Human Services, a very big policy and research staff. Many of those folks are deeply, embedded in the history of those programs, Medicare and Medicaid, and can help people that come in understand what their options are and their choices are, and also point out problems that go, that they might run into if they aren't careful. So I think a lot of that would be lost. And so you'd have more dysfunction and less capable professional civil service, in addition to all the other things that have already been mentioned: potential for corruption, obviously swinging back and forth across time, greater distrust of the institutions. It's just a general lowering of the quality and professionalism of the public service that the public really deserves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim, and also Rachel. We are getting questions coming in. One, I'll just address quickly, what sort of block could Congress provide? I think Congress could certainly pass legislation that would either remove the power that the president is claiming in the executive order that creates Schedule F, which is a delegation of congressional power, or could significantly limit the scale of Schedule F to say something like that the number of appointees who fall within that category cannot be more than, say, 500 individuals. And so there is certainly congressional action that could take place. In the previous Congress, the Democratic House did pass a law that would have limited Schedule F. It did not get through the Senate. There was some attempts to add it to a must-pass defense appropriation bill, but it did not actually end up getting included. Very unlikely, I think, given the makeup of the current Congress, that we will see congressional action on this before November. I'm seeing questions here. So Jen Palka, the author of Recoding America, is on. Jen, do you want to jump in and ask your question or reframe it a little bit?
Hi, glad to be here. This is great. Actually, I just asked a second question, so maybe I'll ask that one instead. I also feel very concerned about Schedule F, but also hear frustration about our civil service system as it stands today. And you're the one, Don, who's originally said this before I was ever tracking this issue, that there needs to be an alternative proposal for change on the table. And I wonder, if you or the other panelists are tracking such efforts. It seems to me critical not just to defend against a change that could have negative consequences, but also to have a forward-looking vision that addresses some legitimate frustrations, or many legitimate frustrations, with, I think it's less actually the policy governing our system today, but the practice of it, which is not necessarily always getting us in line with the principles that the civil service system is supposed to uphold.
So I will let Jim and Rachel respond to that, and maybe suggest that, like, if you have a magic wand where you could offer an alternative model of what the current civil service system looks like, what would that look like?
Well, I'll go first, which is maybe a different way of looking at the same problem in a way that doesn't attack necessarily directly how people become employed, but really more what the agencies see as their mission and their incentive structure for how to manage their own people. I think a big question for the federal civil service is, how can it be more accountable and performance-oriented so that people don't feel like it's underperforming all the time and empire building, and works better with the interests of the taxpayers at heart, and not just sort of building more programs, because then they can build more programs and build more programs and so on. And so to do that, you really need to set goals and provide incentives to the agencies to say, if you could do something with less people maybe, and higher performance and higher productivity, maybe there's a shared savings model. There used to be something called a performance-based organization, where they tried to initiate this during the Clinton administration. I'm not saying that's the be-all and end-all, but some way of thinking about incentives to the agencies to up their game, improve their performance, and deliver better services to the public. I think that kind of thinking might be more helpful than to say we're going to blow up the the GS schedule and do something different. Although I don't think any of the current civil service rules should be outside the bounds of reform. But it's very difficult to devise a new system easily on how to pay people and so on without large controversy. So I think an incentive system to manage and hit goals and performance levels probably has a better upside.
Yeah, first, Jen, I really love your book. I'm a big fan. If you haven't read Recoding America, it outlines a lot of the problems that we're talking about today that are sort of latent in the federal bureaucracy that have gone unaddressed for decades. And so I would say, as a political scientist, I'll answer the question from our perspective first, and then kind of from a broader perspective. And there's just no political incentive, right, for any president to take this up. So every president comes in with some initiative. I'm going to do this to reform government. They're pretty piecemeal. They're always taken down by the next administration. We haven't had comprehensive reform, right, since the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act. So we are at a time where a lot has changed since that time, and how work is done, right? Telework, all these things that are happening are kind of done piecemeal. And so could we have a big reform? It feels like politically, given the lack of an incentive, like a political reward system for presidents or really legislators to take this on, it feels it's going to be piecemeal, and that's kind of depressing. I would say Republicans do have a reform plan, right? It's the one I just talked about, the 2025 plan. It's pretty comprehensive in what agencies would look like in a conservative vision. Democrats are not playing this. They are playing defense, right? They are not thinking, I don't think, systematically about how we can improve this organization. I think that's a big mistake, and sort of there are real problems, right? The conservatives are not wrong when they say we need to be able to fire poor performers. We do. It's very hard, and there are a lot of them, and they should probably be able to go. Whether we want to route them out all with Schedule F, and if those people are actually poor performers, I don't think that's really the same intention. But there should be some deep thinking about how we manage this organization, I think, and I don't see it happening.
Can I respond to that, Don?
Go ahead, Jen.
I completely agree with what you both said. I mean, I think my hope is that there are changes that can be made at the practice level that don't require significant legislative or even real policy changes. I'll note, and I think I can say this with some confidence, though someone may debate me, that time to hire has gone up and use of assessments gone down. Well, definitely time to hire has gone up, not relative to Trump, but relative to Obama. And that's bad. And I don't think it's a result of policy change. I think it's a result of culture and practice. And I'd love to see more effort going into changes that affect culture and practice to get things like time to hire down. I think next on my agenda would be get time to fire down too. But that's obviously going to be a little more difficult. But anyway, I appreciate the answers, and thank you.
Can I just add one more point, which is, I think one of the bigger problems that's like bigger than all of this is the sort of reputation crisis that's at hand, right? Most people hate bureaucracy. You know, they don't like to think about they don't know what the government gives them, and they don't like to hear that, you know, Obama, Trump, Biden are adding career civil servants. That's bad government to most Americans. And that's a problem because, right, we need these people to do the work that they're doing. And when you talk to career civil servants, what they tell you is they're under-resourced and understaffed pretty systematically. And so it's hard to think about, you know, John DiIulio wrote a book saying we should hire 1 million bureaucrats. That's never going to happen because most people think that's like a terror and like the worst thing that could happen to government. And so in sort of resolving all of this, right, you know, what president wants to take this on if it looks so bad to grow the federal workforce? Because I agree with you that we probably do need to improve hiring in a lot of different ways. Well, no one's going to want to do that if it looks so bad. And so it's this broader problem that's sort of circular, right? I don't know how we fix that.
I will add that Don Kettle has been, who is a professor emeritus now at the University of Texas, Austin, has been drafting sort of what he's presenting as a third way of thinking about some of these issues that will be somewhere that annoys both public sector unions and potentially also the conservative critiques of government. You know, I think that there are some broad principles here, which I would frame around the idea of modernization without politicization, because I think if you engage in a modernization project that makes it easier to hire, and hiring is a huge problem, makes it easier to fire, speeds things up, you can go much further on that project if there isn't the shadow of politicization hovering over it. And I think, the additional protections that have been embedded in place since the Civil Service Reform Act partly occurred in the aftermath of some of these actions during the Nixon era. And when you look at other peer states that have well-run civil service systems, they do have more flexibility, but they have less politicization. So I think pushing for more politicized management of personnel, for example, there's some 22-year-old who came off the campaign and who is now firing someone who has 20 years experience in the EPA. Like, that is not the route we want to go, but I think there is a collective agreement that there's some options here that we could pursue in terms of speeding up the way in which the federal government does this job. I'm going to read a question that Mark Peterson presented a while back. People in civil service systems are not just committed to the agency's mission, but also have to follow the dictates of the law governing the activities of the agency. So how do these legal parameters affect bureaucratic action and the role of a Schedule F change? And again, I'd invite Jim or Rachel to jump in.
That seemed like that question might have been directed at a comment I had made, and so I agree with that. I mean, that of course I was trying to make the observation that making a distinction between someone's devotion to an agency's mission, and that's why they're there and committed to it, versus just being kind of a political orientation that drives and motivates how they act. But of course, I do see, and I observed very clearly, that there's also an adherence to the law ethos that is there very strongly in many agencies, and is a good thing. And that does mean that they say, we can't do this because that's not really what Congress wrote a statute to do. And many a political appointee have gotten frustrated by that response from people, from both parties. And I think it's a legitimate restraint on political actors. And it means that if they want to change things, oftentimes they do need to get a law change, which is often harder to get. And so I'm not sure I'm answering the question exactly that might be being posed, but I think legal constraints are very important, and they're there. And so far, even when the Trump era, as was already pointed out, the rule of law around these things was constraining. However, there is still room, and if they do, as was mentioned, pursue legal avenues to do what they want to do, they might have, unfortunately, get a little farther down the road of Schedule F type maneuvers than we would like, because some of that is likely to be illegal.
Yeah, I agree with everything Jim just said. I'll just add that the question really provoked for me a discussion of the Chevron doctrine, right? Which is, its Supreme Court is literally weighing right now, and whether how much policy discretion bureaucrats should have, right? And it's that sort of, as it stands, right, acknowledges there is in statutory interpretation a lot of policy discretion most of the time, where agency personnel are making important decisions, and the courts, we'll see what they say about this, right? Because it may be the case that they are, if the court rules one way in the current Loper-Bright case, that they're actually meaningfully more constrained than they were before. So I guess we'll have to wait and see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think excellent point, Rachel, that there's even beyond what happens with the next election, the role of the administrative state is being adjudicated by the courts right now, and the world of American governance could look very different in the aftermath of that Loper-Bright decision. To the question that was posed, I would just add that those legal constraints, additional forms of accountability that are put in place, often are experienced also as red tape. But as the old saying goes, one man's red tape is another man's procedural accountability. In this particular case, one other contextual factor to bear in mind is, I think, a lesson the Trump administration learned from its first time around is that if they had more aggressive general counsels within agencies, they could get a lot more of their actions blessed as legal. And I, go back often to the first impeachment, where you had an OMB general counsel who was willing to look at the withholding of aid and bless that as legal in an opinion that was not shared publicly and didn't come out until much later and seemed fairly contrary to the direct interpretation of the law. If you have enough of those types of lawyers in place, the definition of what is legal starts to become more and more flexible. Heidi Smith asks a question about how much we could evolve into more of a patronage system, pointing to experiences of in Mexico where she works, where you see potentially people on high levels with also, I think, connections to family members and coming under pressure from political appointees because of some of those patronage connections here. Obviously, of course, the US system's civil service model was a alternative to what we talk about as a spoil system, where there was a significant degree of patronage. And there is, I think, some concern going back to, I think, something Jim said earlier. If you have the potential for 50,000 people to be removed in a change of term, the pendulum that swings back and forth between elections just could be much, much greater at reducing consistencies and stability over time. But I want to leave that open, see if Jim and Rachel want to pick up on that point.
Yeah, I very much agree that that is a very high primary danger. Imagine if there is a Trump administration and they do this and they move out 50,000 people and put all their loyalists in, and then 4 years later, a Democrat wins the White House. There's a Democratic administration. Would they reinstate? Potentially, they might go back and say, let's put them all back into the civil service. That's a possibility. But I bet you they'd be under pressure to put a lot of political loyalists into those open positions too. And, it's hard to predict exactly what would happen, but you could end up with a lot of swings. To the question about whether this patronage and kind of exacting loyalty type to a person type system could play out in the, I think that's definitely what former President Trump has in mind. I mean, that's what he wants. That's his goal, is to have just huge numbers of personally loyal people to him, and he'll use whatever power he can find to try to extract that kind of commitment. Nothing is beneath him, I think, in terms of doing that kind of stuff. So that's why this is so dangerous and everyone should beware.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think that's pretty good analysis.
A question from Warren asking if there's Schedule F like policies that we might see at state and local governments that would tell us more about what's going to happen with a potential second Trump administration and if Schedule F returns. So quick response I would offer there is that we do have some examples of civil service changes in some states, so Georgia, Florida, Texas spring to mind. My sense is that those changes were not terribly well studied, which I would say that's a failure on the part of academics like me. And we don't have a ton of really good evidence around those. But I also am cautious about generalizing from those experiments to the Trump administration, which I think is a different type of beast and has a much more explicit goal of going after what they categorize as the deep state, tapping into some conspiratorial and anti-statist rhetoric, as opposed to some of those previous efforts, which I think the language was much more about how do we improve efficiency, how do we improve responsiveness, rather than the I think somewhat darker rhetoric that the Trump administration has in place. So I think I wish there was a better answer for you, Warren. But again, I'd invite Jim and Rachel to add anything if they wanted to there.
No, I think you hit it. There is very, very little research on those states that have adopted at-will systems. And again, I will reiterate, Don, and say the intent in those was really technocratic. Like, how can we hire people quicker? How can we fire people quicker? It was not ideologically motivated in the same way that this appears to be.
Question from James Goldwyn. Biden administration has been working to democratize the administrative state by increasing public participation and other tools. Does this have some potential to prevent or counter improper politicization of the administrative state? What are your thoughts on this general approach? And maybe Rachel, I would invite you to start with that, because that's sort of a broader regulatory state question.
Yeah, so what James is referring to is a number of different actions, but in the regulatory sphere, an effort to really get all kinds of different stakeholders to participate in things like the rulemaking process. How can we amplify the voices of sort of more marginalized group or people that haven't historically participated in that process, which tends to be dominated by industry interests and well-heeled groups generally. And so those are pretty new efforts. We don't really know what's going to happen with them, how effective they'll be on their own. So that's one point to take to heart, is we just don't know yet how this is going to work. And I would say, you know, in the rulemaking sphere, what they're trying to get done is to encourage people to participate and send comments in more, but agencies are not required to listen to comments. They were required to respond to them. And so in sort of thinking about the relative weight I would give to a change like that versus actually changing the personnel working on that policy, I would say in that particular case of rulemaking, I wouldn't hold out a lot of hope that that would be a counterweight to the politicization that we might see.
A question from Genevieve Cantor. There's a fair number of political appointment positions that can be filled either by political appointees or career civil servants. Many are filled by civil servants. Could that happen with Schedule F appointments so they could be less worrying under the right circumstances? I think if I'm interpreting the question correctly, the answer would be that the positions could be filled by career officials, but they would be then vulnerable to being removed, right? So they would essentially be former career officials by definition once they take on the Schedule F position, and they would lose their career protections. I think certainly the question is correct. You often see career officials step into political appointee roles, sometimes on a temporary basis, but usually with the expectation that they have either explicitly left their career position behind in some cases, or that the sort of temporary basis does not negate their career position protections, which is something that would be different with Schedule F, where effectively they would lose those protections as well. But is my interpretation right or wrong there, Jim and Rachel? Is there anything else?
I think you got it right. I just would note that over successive administrations going back a long time, the Presidential Office of Personnel, or the Office of Presidential Personnel, they have pretty well scoped out the things that they can easily control with an appointment process versus being part of the civil service. To the extent that there are positions that can flip back and forth a little bit, they tend to be identified more by the appointments once they get there into these agencies, and they find a good career civil servant who's has good skills, and they may sometimes move them into a position that could be both career and political, and at which point that they, like you said, could likely be removed during a change in administration. So most of the corners of this have been explored pretty well, and I think the whole idea of Schedule F was to break through some of the normal constraints and go big with political appointments.
We are approaching time, so I'm going to ask my two co-panelists if they have final thoughts here before they wrap up, things that we haven't touched on. I think also why we should care about this, and I'll start by saying I think this is a point of vulnerability in the American system of governance that we haven't paid a lot of attention to, partly because much of our system of governance was based on a certain set of norms and expectations about how government should work within the context of I think broader liberal democratic expectations of governance. And this, I think, reveals, some of the vulnerabilities of that particular approach. The thing that keeps me up at night is the fact that this is so complicated and you need to have a fair degree of sophistication to understand how government works for this rather obscure issue of Schedule F to be on your radar. And so I'm at a loss of how to communicate that. But Rachel, I'll offer you a sort of 90-second opportunity to weigh in here if there's something else you want to touch before we go back to.
Sure. I'll just say that, Schedule F in and of itself, if we just take it on its face value, is not a bad reform, right? We just talked about states like Georgia that tried to implement at-will employment, and so the difference here is really a question of intent, right? And so what is this administration intending to do with this reform? And what I see it as is an attempt to centralize power, right? And so as a scholar of the executive branch, what we've seen over time is an aggrandizement of executive power. So the U.S. president has gained power over decades and centuries even. And so it's a worrying power grab from my perspective, in that sense, that we have someone who has described himself as a very stable genius trying to aggrandize power. And at the same time, we don't see Congress well equipped to counterbalance that in any meaningful way. And so that, from sort of like a separation of powers standpoint, is in itself worrying.
I'll take a slightly different tack. I agree basically with that point of view, but I guess what I was going to say is that I think one big vulnerability we have here is that there hasn't been, as has been discussed by some of the questions, a real management reform effort put forward in a serious way in quite some time. If you think back to the Clinton administration, the Reinventing Government initiative was very high profile. I mean, it was sort of technocratic and good government and so on, but it was high profile. They were saying, we're going to try to make the government work better on your behalf. And they had some success. Everything wasn't successful, but it was a high priority. In the Bush administration that I worked in, management of the federal bureaucracy and trying to improve its performance was a very high priority. I think if you want to counter this push to politicize the civil service, there needs to be another push to say, the federal government it's continually needing an updating and modernizing and improvement for the public service. People pay their taxes to fund this government, and someone needs to be saying, let's make it work on their behalf better over time.
That is a terrific way, I think, to end this conversation. I'd like to thank James and Rachel for participating here, everyone who submitted a question, everyone who joined us for the hour, and of course to APPAM for hosting this webinar and bringing this important topic to a broader conversation. Thank you all, and look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in real life soon.